I would like to thank our top sponsors Bergamo, Fergus Ryan, Sean Roberts, Matthias Proy, and Ivan Newston for making the show possible. And welcome to the Cave of Apelles. Tonight we are focusing on the so-called rough or open way of painting, made famous by masters such as late Titian or Rembrandt. The manner is known to give a vivid effect and goes back to at least ancient Greece, with Pliny describing the technique of Apelles. Is it superior to other ways, such as photo-realism? My guest says yes. But does it really lead up to modernism, as art historians argue? My guest says no. David Molesky, welcome to the Cave of Apelles.
Thank you.
You better deliver now.
Yeah, I guess so. Wow. Where should we begin?
We should begin by stating that we are old friends.
Yep. In fact, this painting behind us is a relic from our adventures in painting together. In 2006 is when I arrived.
Yeah.
And so I think this painting is from maybe 2007. And I was doing a lot of landscape painting in the area, and you were doing some really beautiful watercolors in the forest. And I was admiring them one day and like, oh, where are you painting those? And you told me there's a big, beautiful forest nearby, and I asked if I could come with you. And I found this little section of woods that felt like it had a very nice kind of room to it. And I started painting it, and then just felt like someone could be running through it. and that's and there it is. And yeah, and eventually I gave it to Odd because he seemed to really like it. I was painting in the studio. I don't know if you still call it the Paris studio.
Yeah.
And no one else was working in there. The light was very cold and the temperature was kind of cold too. And he would come in and often not acknowledge me very much or what the other things I was doing, and come right to that painting and stand in front of it and sometimes just turn and leave again. Like he just wanted to see that. And so one time, and he kept doing it. So one time he came in and I said, "Oh, you like that painting, huh?" He's like, "Oh, yes. I'm like, do you want it?" And he's like, "Oh, thank you very much." And then walked out. So
That was the story.
Yeah. And so now it's here. So we were borrowing it for this filming.
You didn't have to drag anything from the glorious United States of America to bring with you.
No. Which was good because, travel light, travel far.
Yeah.
And had a few stops on the way here. So, yeah.
Perfect. But the thing that really interested me when we were talking together, because we tried to do this once before, or to try to get you to come, and of course we had the whole COVID situation and all that. And but then when we talked again, you started talking about Pliny, the Greeks, rough manner. Mm-hmm. So you want to kick that off?
Because I can dive in. So, maybe I don't know if you've covered it in previous episodes, but how kind of the interest of Apelles kind of emerged
Tell the story.
Here in Nerdrum's circle. I remember, in regards to the four-color palette, for example, there was a painter here, a Chilean painter, Guillermo Lorca, and he kept asking Odd, like, what colors did Rembrandt use? And I think Odd just sort of like brushed it off a few times. And then one time I was in the studio with both of them, and he goes, "Okay, do you want to know what colors he uses?" Just white, black, yellow, red, and that's it. And Guillermo was like, "Wow, really?" He's like, "Yeah, I tried it. It was a lot of work mixing all the colors together, and my arm got very tired very quickly." And I was like, "Well, what if you just pre-mixed all the colors the way you want, so you have them ready when you paint. So then I think maybe it was about a week of experimentation for him to figure out which red and which yellow in particular would best suit that limited palette. And then he landed on the Sennelier, was it the
Chinese vermilion?
Yeah, Chinese vermilion, and the Old Holland yellow brown. And both of those are kind of interesting because they don't. I mean, the yellow brown has, I think, one ochre color and then two synthetic yellows, and then the Chinese vermilion is like two synthetic colors. So they're very contemporary colors in actuality, but their behavior mimics historic colors. So yeah, then that was the beginning of the 4-color palette in regular use, and in this kind of way of mixing the colors together to make a range and then packing them back into tubes and having them on the ready when you start the painting to reduce the amount of mixing needed while you're actually working. And I think then there was a recognition of, that Pliny had mentioned that Apelles had also used those colors. And then I remember coming back on visits, and Odd seemed to have an increasing interest in paintings that were left over from the eruption of Vesuvius from Pompeii and those areas, and that he was beginning to incorporate some of the appearances from those into his paintings. So,
is that why you wanted this image to the left there here?
Yeah. Yeah, because that, in my understanding from particular Odd, that these paintings were kind of copies of what Apelles' work might have looked like. And so in Pliny describes Apelles in his introduction as basically the greatest painter who's ever lived and who ever will live. And then, of course, now we have no examples of his work because his work remained in close to Alexander the Great in his libraries and homes and such, which were destroyed. I don't know the exact history of their disappearance, but they no longer exist. So they are fabricated by our imagination based on the text that Pliny gives us in terms of what their qualities were.
Yeah, and so what does it say about them?
It says a lot of various things, but one of the things that he says that Apelles excelled in beyond everyone else was this concept of charis, which means basically translates to charm. So there's an acknowledgement, even from Apelles himself apparently, that some of his contemporaries excelled in various different qualities, much more than he did maybe proportion or modeling or perspective or finish. And he acknowledged that these other painters could, do those things better than he could, but the overall effect of his paintings had more charm. So it's like, how do you want to interpret this idea of charm? The way I think about it is, if you just think about charm in regards to a person who's charming, you want to spend more time with them. You want to engage them more. And if you start to match that idea with some of the other qualities that are described, and the interpretation of these texts by other artists throughout history, then I think you can start to kind of piece together what makes up for a charming painting.
I'm excited to hear that, because honestly, it sounds very open and undefined, right?
Yeah.
To say that something is charming, it's But yeah, go ahead.
So one of these ideas that comes up. Well, there's the rough idea of painting. We know that he sometimes laid paintings maybe quite thickly or roughly. Apelles.
Yeah.
And there was also a discussion about one of his paintings of Aphrodite. And he had made two versions. He made one that was kind of unfinished, and there was one that was more finished. I think Apelles was interested in the commentary of his work and was very open to hearing people's feedback. And so I think he was aware of how human consciousness works in relation to a painting. There was a story that he would put his paintings out kind of on display and eavesdrop on some of the comments going by. There's a story about the sandal maker, and he made a comment that something was wrong with the sandal that Apelles painted. And so Apelles corrected it, put the painting back out, and the shoemaker was kind of excited to see his suggestion was taken, and then started to make a comment about the leg. And there's some phrase where, he basically says, stick to your own expertise. You don't know anything about legs. And then, says it audibly for the guy to hear.
Right.
But, so back to understanding how people experience a painting and making a painting that's charming. And relating it to other ways of representation. I think that's kind of what we're getting to. And also at the examples of how different people interpreted the text. So, people started reading it quite a lot during the Renaissance, and there's evidence that, Leonardo and Michelangelo and Donatello were all influenced and had access and had copies of this text. And then, of course, we know that Titian was also very inspired by it, and Rembrandt, and all of the people who were inspired by them, and Velázquez and Rubens. But one of the kind of abstract qualities that I think this thing offers to individual painters is an opportunity to collaboratively compete with something that is not in their immediate vicinity. So they're not reliant on, it's the idea of playing. If you want to get better at tennis, you play tennis with someone who's better than you. But what if you're the best tennis player? And what are you going to do? So I think this text, you can imagine Apelles, who is apparently the greatest who's ever lived and ever will live. And so in your imagination, with the guidance of these descriptions by Pliny, you create this painter who you are trying to live up to with your work. And your interpretation of it affects your own work. So there was this unfinished show at the Met Breuer, which you saw.
In New York, yeah.
Yeah, and you were filming and went through there, and they gathered some very interesting old masterworks that some were questionably unfinished. I mean, they had the Flay of Marsyas.
Yeah, Titian here.
Yeah, which has been, I considered it like probably my favorite painting in the world for a long time. I first saw it with Odd in Venice.
Oh yeah.
I wasn't with Odd when I saw it, but I went to the museum and I sat in front of it for hours until I fell asleep and the guard had to wake me up. But it's very hallucinogenic, sort of. Like, it looks like it comes alive, it starts moving. And so that's a painting that really invites you into, this kind of idea, which now is like trending a little bit, this long looking, or this idea of spending time in front of a painting. I think some museum docents and things are bringing the public in and encouraging them to sit and spend time with paintings and to see what sort of experience they can get when they look at it for a long time, and to understand that painting offers you a different type of vision than photography can, for example. And this painting, it's very clear, because if you look at all of the digital reproductions of it, if you were just to Google the painting and just see that in an image search, all the different things that come up, they all are very different tonally. And that's because in his process, and he's late in life, he did all of these all-over glazes. Stories say like he did like 40 all-over glazes in working on this painting. And the way, light works is that the light photons travel through all these layers and bounce off different ones. And the camera collects the light in kind of an instant, but the eye kind of collects them all over time and develops the image from the interaction between all of this information from the different layers, and it comes alive in a way that a photo can never capture.
Yeah.
So you have to sit in front of it.
But then, is Apelles' technique described in so much detail that you can recreate the technique?
No, there's a lot of missing
Yeah.
holes.
Yeah.
But I think that's good, though, because it allows for some innovation. Interpretation.
But it does say that it was rough. I mean, as opposed to being clearly delineated and sharp lines and.
Yeah, I think it wasn't. Well, what we know from, for example, the description of the Aphrodite is that some parts were very developed and other parts were left almost barely there. And I think this ties back into the idea of like what's a charming type of painting. So it seems, another story is that Apelles knew when to take his hand away. So in other words, I think he knew the hierarchy of like how humans visualize space. Like it seems like there was an understanding of the cognition of human vision and what is prioritized and what is just sort of filled in with the brain. Because basically that's how human vision works. To have a continuous view of the world, there's no way that photons come in from all the things that you see in your vision at every given moment. Most of it is just projected from your cortex based on like memory and stored concepts. So if you were to create a painting where you gave the information on the parts that you needed new information to be guided in terms of what the vision is, like a face. So Apelles, when he painted the Aphrodite of Kos, that was the unfinished version, he gave a lot of rendering and detail in the face and bust, and then apparently the rest of the body went kind of looser and rougher. So I guess when you looked at it, you saw the face and the bust, and your mind sort of continued that rendering into the parts that he didn't render. In a way,
if you can get the outline correctly, so that you give all the information to what is in between contour lines.
But even if you, but there's also like engaging how peripheral vision works.
Exactly.
So apparently the story of like how the Mona Lisa smile works is a play on, the position of the rods and cones in the retina. So you have cones, which are for color vision. They're also for detail. They're closer to the fovea, which is the center of vision. So that's where you can detect like sharp lines a little bit better. But when you go outside from that, it's peripheral vision. It handles things, and you kind of fill in the information. So when you look at Mona Lisa and her eyes, and your fovea, your center of vision is towards the eyes, the sfumato of the corners of the mouth get read as a smile. But when you bring your eye down and you have the cones, you detect the line, and she's not smiling.
Right. So there's a sense of movement, actually.
Yeah, and life. Yeah.
And also, because that really fascinates me, what you're saying about that unfinished Aphrodite figure by Apelles. So you look at the upper part, and in your side vision you see the rest of the body as you would when you're looking at a real person.
Yeah.
And so obviously if you delineated the rest equally, made it equally detailed, that would compete with the most important thing.
Yeah, there would be a conflict, and you would have to rely on the viewer to apply their own sense of hierarchy to it. But in painting it that way, you guide the viewer into you establish the hierarchy of vision. You guide the eye to what you want. You show what's important and what's not important. And in my thinking about this and on my travels here and just going to museums, and I could see it again and again and again. I could see it in, there's a portrait by Velázquez that I saw in Munich just a few days ago, and it's, the head is beautifully rendered, and then he gets away with the hands just barely sketched in. But when you look at the head, it doesn't bother you, and then you look and you're like, wow, that's really all he did with the hands? Like, I could have sworn there was a hand there. Or, Rubens does it too. Like, you might have like a figure's torso lit and one of the legs, but with the foot in the back that is not in the light, just sort of blends into, like a sketch, like the preliminary brushwork of the painting. And
exactly. And then you're talking about really getting the general form of whatever it is. Because again, the general form gives so much information to what is, or between these two contour lines of the foot, for example. Yeah.
It's sort of, it's there just enough that the viewer can do the rest. And I think that's part of also the engaging thing, because it's kind of enjoyable. And it started in the Renaissance. It became sought after, oil sketches, and people began to appreciate this thing that Gombrich was calling magic transformation. This idea that, maybe like a drag of paint could, when you step back, like crystallize into something that looked real.
Well, that's also why, you have that, where is it, in which book is that? Is it The Painter at Work? Anyways, people wanting to study his painting up close, and apparently Rembrandt would say, oh, they look better from afar. Yeah. So that would be the same thing then.
But I think I think better from afar, I think that's part of the fun and the enjoyment and the charm, is that someone has transformed this kind of goopy substance and has reminded you on the surface that we're dealing with really just a goopy substance that's a bit like weird and messy, but it's very easily becoming something that it's not. Yeah.
Just to draw a parallel, saying the same thing that you're saying now. There's something that I noticed with Roald Dahl when he writes his short stories. You have that story called The Hostess, I guess, in English, where this man coming and he needs to spend the night, rings the door, and as immediately he's rung the door opens. So she's obviously been waiting for him. Comes in, and there's all kinds of descriptions of how there's a smell there that it comes all the time, and the dog is still by the fire, and he notices, well, it hasn't actually moved the whole time. And she talks about the former guests that have been there, that are still there, and it's like everything is kind of weird. And you understand from all of these things that what she's done is to what do you call it? She's a taxidermist.
Oh no!
And she's done that with the former guests too, and it's never said straight out.
Okay.
And the whole sort of joy of discovering that's actually what's going on. That's what she's doing. Hey, get out of there! Right. There's some. Do you see the parallel? That it's not described, but there's a joy in. I guess that's the charm then of it.
Yeah. And I think this is a word that is maybe overused, but like painterly.
Mm.
So one of my mentors before I came to study with Odd, David Ligare, he would say sometimes that he saw that the way I, would just be really kind of into paint itself and like its own qualities, that he would say that I was like a painterly painter, and that he used paint more as an illustrator. Like he used it as a tool.
Because I remember you showed me, as I remember it, he's quite clear.
Yeah,
and in terms of lines, in terms of color.
I mean, he's sort of a photorealist. Right. Okay. Yeah. He has like a neoclassical. Exactly. Yeah. He's not straight photorealist. He definitely invents and composes and is influenced by ideas and concepts from ancient Greece and Rome, and so in that way it's not really appropriate to just kind of plant him in the group. So I was at Meme recently, and their collection is
in Barcelona, the museum.
I mean, they have some things that are kind of like, that's interesting, and then other paintings that are strange because you can't even see that they're paintings. That there's no evidence of even the substance of paint in the whole thing, and I find that very strange. They look like a painting, but they're actually made of paint. I mean, they look like a photo, but they're actually made of paint. It's like, why not just have a photo at that point?
Yeah.
But that's that's trying to, like, the value is maybe in the skill, but. There's one, yeah.
I was thinking about something because it's when you talk about this, we also have Rembrandt, this portrait in the Frick collection there in the middle.
Yeah.
But with this way, this rough or open or way of painting, I'm used to referring to it as the Technica Macchia.
Technica Macchia?
Yeah.
What does that mean?
Well, I'm not exactly sure, but it's that roughness of it. Yeah, what Macchia means. But anyways, and I'm thinking, where does that not work anymore? Because it's the point of this is not that you
make a big mess.
You show that this is a lot of paint on canvas.
Right. Yeah.
Of course, it has to be credible according to what it is. I mean, like the Jewish bride, the famous sleeve of his.
Yeah.
When he builds up thick, it's to recreate matter.
Yeah.
And not just to paint thick. I mean, because if you contrast that with, for example, Sargent, then you see there's a lot of strokes all over, but it becomes sort of too democratic. Everything is stroke based. So that would not be what Pliny is talking about in Sargent's case, but it would be so in the Jewish bride, for example.
Yeah, I feel like Sargent is working in a more like narrow technical band.
Yeah.
I mean, his underpainting looks like his overpainting. It's all very. It's maybe not all done a la prima.
Same process or same attitude the whole way through. Yeah.
Yeah, and then whereas if you take, I don't know, even like one of the Rubens paintings, like it's a little bit more like stretched out, like you can see down to the ground, like the tinted ground in some places.
The variation in the application of paint, you mean?
Yeah. So like the level of development of the work almost appears to be like stretched out and made visible, all layers of the process. And I think that's one of the things that Pliny was saying that people were really appreciating about some of the works that were left unfinished by different circumstances, either maybe the commission fell through or the artist died, but something that interrupted the process, that these works were often very highly regarded because it showed the process, and the people looking at the paintings very much appreciated that.
But isn't that sort of a corollary to I'm thinking of, if you read Aristotle, his idea of the catharsis, and it's about sort of adjusting your emotions. If you feel too much emotion in the wrong situation, then you're out of balance. And for people like that, having a cathartic experience can be cleansing or helpful to balance you. But if you don't have that problem, then you can both see the value of this great drama, but you can also, in addition to that, just appreciate the quality of how it's made. Like, technically speaking, you can add that to it. So I'm just thinking about I'm trying to fish out of you this idea of how it is understood in modern times, what Pliny is talking about, where it's very often described as something that is pointing towards modern. I mean, wasn't the Norwegian art historian on the radio talking about that was about Pietà, but still Titian. Pietà in Venice, and saying that this is pointing forward to expressionism.
Yeah, I feel like the people who say that are not aware that this actually came from antiquity. That these qualities were highly valued in antiquity, even down to like minimalism painting, because you have the story of Apelles visiting Protogenes. You know the line within the line within the line. Tell it, because
that's it. Because that's a story that tests if you are able to understand what they're actually talking about.
Okay, well, I might not have the same understanding, so I'm curious to hear your take. Well, if you agree with me,
it's correct, but
okay. I want to hear what you have to say about it after, but I'll just tell the story very quickly. But Apelles had heard about Protogenes, and he wants. Am I saying it correctly as far as you know, Protogenes?
You know what? Honestly, because we don't have the paintings, I always mix up the names.
Okay.
Yeah. So, anyways,
Protogenes was known for being very detailed and very refined, and I guess he was not as well known as Apelles. But Apelles was very curious about his paintings, so he went to go visit where he lives, but he wasn't there. And so I think some property caretaker person answered the door and was like, "Oh, he's not here." And he saw a panel. And he was like, "Well, just show him this." And he made a very fine line down the panel. And so then Protogenes comes back and goes, "Oh, Apelles must have been here. No one could do that other than, Apelles." And so then he makes a line within the line. Like, take that, And then he's like, if he comes back, show him that. And so Apelles comes back and sees that and makes an even finer line, like a line that no line could be made inside the line. And then apparently that panel was like saved and was really highly regarded. A lot of people, appreciated it for its emptiness but its story that it contained. So in some ways that looks like some kind of minimalist
It sounds
painting.
like it's abstract art,
It's like abstract art made in antiquity and was appreciated then. So it's, the abstract art and the minimalist art, it already existed in antiquity. A lot of things have their roots in antiquity. So the concept of like new and original is very false.
There are several stories about that, and I think that story can be interpreted as a display that yes, they would actually like to be abstract painters, but as far as I understand, the point is that this is the level of security of my hand. Mm-hmm. This is how solid I am. Mm-hmm. And the line is a very clear example of it, where you go right to the core of how secure can I be when I paint.
Yeah.
And I think if Protogenes then was being more detailed, and I guess clear line and sort of more drawn,
right,
then Apelles shows that, well, he has that as well, as this rough manner of painting, because it's something that
I like that interpretation, because then it relates, I think, very well to Titian and Rembrandt, who had incredible detail capabilities and showed them off a lot when they're also Turner.
Yeah, that's something that Odd Nerdrum was mentioning quite a few times when he really started to get into Titian. I remember. Of course, he was before too, but I mean, when he really got into it, like this crown on the old man of the
Midas.
Yeah. How suddenly there has to be something that is extremely exact that holds it together, so it doesn't become all a big cloud, right? A formless cloud.
Yeah.
But you also see it. That was really fascinating. I saw once. I was out walking. I stopped by this auction house, and there was. I guess the English title is Liberation from 70 whatever.
By who?
Odd.
Okay.
The intercourse. The woman is sitting on top of the man.
Oh, okay.
And the interesting thing was, or the striking thing was that this was in a period where he was really studying Caravaggio, and to tighten up and be exact and get the form correct. But that very same day, I came down here. And he was working on a mother and child. And the child, like if you looked around the contour line of the actual head, you could basically not find any line. Mm. So it was so dissolved, but it was still much more exact and clear in form than that painting from the 70s. Yeah. So that's how I see that story about that line. It's like I have security, clarity of form. I know what I'm doing, and I can start juggling around with where the focus should be. Yeah.
That Flaying of Marsyas. I mean, in some of like the painting, the Flagellation of Christ that's in Munich that I just saw. I was like looking at some of like the feet.
Titian, yeah.
And the like you could reach out and grab the foot, but like it's barely there. I mean, it's not. He did not fuss over a drawing to contain the foot, but he, it's that idea again, this like magic transformation, and it's not easily replicated. You need to know how to draw to be able to pull it off. So maybe modern art is just a poor imitation of these qualities. Yeah, I don't know.
No, but that's. I've been thinking about that. How you make art, or modern art, as you say, is to take one little detail of all the techniques that all master must know, and you take that out of context, and you do just that.
It's reductionism,
and you don't use it as a tool to get to some kind of a realistic rendering. For example, the sketch. Okay, if I just do brushstrokes, that's like sort of the essence of the sketch, right? But it's completely removed from what the point is.
Right. Yeah. So I think it's like a some kind of like, I don't know, post-enlightenment reductionism of art. And where you can take the parts and make them as important as the whole.
Yeah. Well, but that's the whole thing that happens to them. That you start getting landscape painter, or still life painter, or portrait painter. These specific things, where you separate all the different things that. I mean, if you can paint a human figure holding some fruit in a landscape, performing some action, then there's a totality of
right. And there's concept and there's story,
Exactly.
And there's, all kinds of things coming into it. It's very complex. Yeah, it's very rich and full. Yeah.
But does Pliny say anything about painting like that before you're old? Because I think Vasari talks about that. This is something that is more vivid, but be careful, young man, not to go directly into it.
Yeah. I think Vasari is the one that kind of warns that it's not something that's easy to be done. But Pliny doesn't very much. He's just sort of commenting on people's various talents. I think because I think the era that he's talking about in ancient Greece, that Apelles kind of stood out in terms of his ability to go from the line within the line within the line to this sort of like evaporating realism. Yeah, and to have it all work cohesively well, and what are the stories? There's stories about like the horse. Something about like he made paintings of horses, and the horses liked the paintings, and like they were impressed. So it's also using the physicality. I think Rembrandt is someone who does this really well in terms of like in combination with the human figure, is using the physicality of paint to create the illusion of a human presence. And
recreating matter. It's not just copying color, but recreating matter.
Yeah, because paint has a physicality and a presence to it in its essence. And if you can match that with a representational image, an illusion, then you have you can marry the two together and also use like the paint magic, where like you're able to remind the viewer, if they come close, that this is really just paint. And then when they step back, they're given the illusion of it. I mean, I think that is sort of the essence of a charming painting. And if you can, in addition to that, bring in some like good story or good concept, then you're improving it even more. But I feel like the essence of good painting lies within just sort of like.
Well, you get that illusion, and we're not talking about trompe l'oeil to trick the eye with illusionism, but you get the illusion of something being realistically present, and then you can go into it and you can see the mastery with which it's done. Yeah. That you can have that stroke and it works, but it's a stroke. Yeah. And the point is then not to appreciate, here's a stroke, but that is so masterly depicting what it should represent or support if it's a contour line, let's say. But I think the mistake is if you start saying then, they were concerned with having paint on canvas, because that was not the issue, that it should be paint, right? Or it should just be paint.
It has to serve the illusion. I have a little anecdotal story kind of in regards to that. One evening, I was in Odd's studio and hanging out with him, watching him paint, and he's like, "I'm going to go get dinner. Here, paint a scarf." It was a painting of, I think, Minden on the white horse.
Oh, yeah.
And so I was like, oh, geez, I have to paint this scarf, on this painting. And so I really was like very careful. I tried to do a good job. I was using a brush, and I felt pretty good about it. I was like, I think he should be pretty happy with it. Maybe he'll touch it up a little bit. And he comes back from dinner. He's like, "Oh, yeah. Very fine. You could have also done it like this." And he took a rag and went like dab, 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 and then just went in one motion. And it was like the most, like, it blew my mind. It was like a 3D scarf all of a sudden appeared on the canvas in one stroke. That was like, that was amazing. I mean, it was like this, worse than the story of Protogenes and Apelles. Oh no! That was very fun. And then, and also similar to that, I was, it was around probably when I painted that. I was painting like 5 different places a day in the landscape. So I'd start out at like
5 different landscape paintings?
Yeah, around here, outside. Like I'd start at the like the rock going out to the ocean, and I wanted to paint it in the first light. So I had to be up at like 4:30 in the morning and put like 4 pairs of pants on, and I don't know, it was cold. And the days were very long. I was working hard, and I was working on that painting in his studio before I went to bed, and I was exhausted. I was falling asleep while I was painting, and I didn't really remember making this mark, but I was trying to like depict this idea of like the rays coming in into the composition. So I think I just went like this, like made this mark. And when I came in the next day, he has a good way of reading people, obviously, So he saw me looking at it like, he's like, "You made that mark. I saw you do it." Because I was wondering, like, where did this come from? And he's like, it makes the painting. And it was true. It was that one kind of like, it just contained the concept of the light coming in. It was what the painting needed.
Yeah, and that's also another fascinating thing. If you think about the really good drawings by Munch or Toulouse-Lautrec or others, Odd Nerdrum obviously, where and I guess that plays into what you were saying, that Apelles understood that there were people who were sort of better at getting the form correct or better at this and that, but he had that charm. And so getting back to the drawings, where you have that line that has this rhythm in it.
Yeah.
So that the actual line also has life.
Yeah.
And not just that it copies the form correctly and then it changes there and it goes up there and here is darker, here is lighter, but it has life in itself.
Yes.
So I think that's something in that, when we're talking about this loose or rough way of painting, and again, which you must never misunderstood as something that the goal is the line as such, but it is to describe what it is.
Yeah, the goal is not the roughness.
No, it's like you have to sort of fight against it as long as you can.
Yeah,
because I've seen students of his thinking they could jumpstart and go right to late Titian. Yeah, and it just fell apart.
Yeah, late Titian. My understanding with his working, but I mean this is after he's done so many detailed and marvelously executed paintings. But his late paintings, he would start them and kind of block them in with a very large brush, and then kind of like turn them to the wall for a while, and then kind of work into it again.
Do you know? This is something that Odd Nerdrum mentioned in The Hunt of Odd Nerdrum. What Aristotle is talking about in the rhetoric, and do I remember it correctly? There's something about comparing, like giving a lecture compared to giving a speech. Lecture going in, describing things and sort of being detailed, but in the speech where you're going to arouse people, you have to use a broad brush, metaphorically speaking. Yeah. And so the connection was literally, if you are going to make a painting, you have to be more loose to get that totality, to get the connection from A to C.
Yeah, I think there's a lot. Yeah, I think it's also like creating a space for visual engagement or the engagement of the person perceiving it. I mean, I'm sorting that out with my current work, for better or for worse. I don't know yet. I mean, I'm still working. But I think one of the concepts that I'm trying to engage a viewer with is this experience of awe. And one of the phenomenological experiences connected to experiences of awe is like a dissolution of boundaries, where there is a kind of a melting of the border of yourself with your environment, and then relating that in a visual depiction in places, in a similar way to the kind of open manner.
Mm-hmm.
So, and I think to leave things open to interpretation, like you would in a speech, or to go for this sort of general thing, and to allow someone to sort of project themselves into it a little bit more, makes it more charming. It's in the same way, like if you, this is another story from my time here. There was a painting that I was doing of the man with two horses.
Oh yeah, I remember that.
Yeah, because you modeled for the study too. We were
true.
creating modeling
That's true.
time, and then you helped.
You were on a horse
horses.
for me too, so
yes,
yeah.
yes, and yeah, Odd really liked it.
I'm
and
sorry.
then
I just got into my head that image of you standing in the background of a photo, painting naked with a hat on.
I wanted to get the natural light, because what I learned, from David Ligare is that if you really want to depict natural light, like the reflection into the core shadows of the sky and the grass, like if you really want to have it have a sense of like realism in the space, you have to do like what Cezanne said, is that you have to you can see the world within an apple, like you see the reflection of its surroundings inside the apple.
You need to know that they reflect each other.
Yeah. So I was outside painting that, but
Back to the horse.
Yeah, Odd was very enthusiastic about that painting in a way. He was maybe at first more enthusiastic than this one, but it was like about 4 by 5 feet, or like 120, 140 centimeters, and. But one day I started telling him about some of the inspirations behind it, and he kind of let me go, and I maybe said too much. And in my kind of like telling him too much, maybe closed off for him to sort of like input his own projections in terms of interpretation. And he kind of said, he's like, I wish you didn't tell me all that. I don't like it as much anymore. And I was like, oh no. My big mouth. What am I doing?
Well, it's
so related to the speech thing. You have to give to give space for someone to project into, and that's makes it more charming.
Exactly. So you don't tell them what to think of it.
Yeah. So if you box someone out, and I feel like in this transition I'm making with my paintings now, where maybe just like a couple years ago, I was really kind of defining everything. And I kind of noticed that as I was finishing them, that there would get to be this point, it goes back to like know when to take your hand away. It would get to a point where I thought I was just like taking care of faults, but I started to maybe find them less charming. And friends coming to my studio, whether they were painters or collectors or just people don't know a lot about art, they would all say kind of the same thing. They'd be like, what's that over there? I'm like, oh, I'm just starting that one. And they were like, they kind of gravitated to these beginnings, because in the beginnings, especially because I tend to like to work over the whole composition at once and not just do one thing at a time, that my initial kind of intuition in building the image was there was already a hierarchy of what was important versus what's not important, and so it left space for people to. So
you start to map things out too much, so to speak.
Explain
too much.
Yeah.
I mean, it wasn't protagonist, but this is something I mentioned a couple of times because it's so funny. This painter who apparently referred to himself, or was called in ancient Greece, kata texitechnos, which means something like he who ruins his art, discipline, because or his paintings, because he was so concerned with detail, and then you scatter the attention all over the place.
Yeah.
So because it's a tricky thing, that what we're talking about here, because it might easily sound like, okay, just a sketch, and stop in time. That's
Right.
a whole
Yeah,
cliche.
yeah,
Like,
yeah.
how do you? What's your take on that? How do you go into this without sort of falling off over the edge?
Right. I think. How do you say it? Hoogstraaten.
Hoogstraaten. Yeah.
Hoogstraaten.
Yeah, the student of
Yeah.
Rembrandt. Yeah.
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 Hoogstraaten.
The people who did a lot of writing and where
he
we
wrote
get a
the
lot
Schilder
of
book or something
yeah,
like that.
we get a lot of information about Rembrandt's workshop through him. But he said something to the effect that like a master knows when something of like the initial pass is perfectly apt for that part.
Yeah.
So
Know what to keep
Yeah.
or not paint over later.
yeah, so let's say you're making a sketch and you kind of brush in the outline of the whole figure, but like let's say this foot is sort of in shadow and in the background. And as you develop the painting, maybe that initial pass on that foot in the background is perfectly apt to describe that foot, and it serves its function perfectly well. So that's when it's like, when to take your hand away, because then if you were to go in and sort of like flesh out that foot with the same materiality of paint, it would maybe come forward, it may not occupy its space, it may like draw the attention around in a way that's not really supporting the overall composition.
Yeah. And that's something I'm really concerned with, how the way it's painted, the actual strokes, the actual paint, can create a psychological mood. Because you have to start somewhere. It's.
Yeah.
I like when I do guided tours or talk about or do these master classes. It's always about how it's structured. That goes into this. This is repeated here. Whatever. Purely technical, with the point of explaining how the story works or why that makes the story work.
Yeah.
But there's a concrete example of exactly what you're talking about there. I remember Odd was working on breastfeeding fog. And she's lying there in this sort of almost like a cone, like you see her from above.
Oh yeah, yeah.
Yeah. And with the two children, breastfeeding two children, and you see the faces. He did that in one pass.
Wow.
And didn't touch it.
Wow.
And it's all sort of sunken in the sense of that it's in shadow, and in shadow, of course, you don't get a lot of contrast. So the way it's painted makes it recede.
Yeah.
But also, of course, with the expression. But that way of painting makes her completely go into that state that she's in.
Yes.
So the way it's painted shows her psychological state.
Perfect. Yeah. Yeah.
Yeah. It's
and that's magic when that happens.
Yeah.
And sometimes that just emerges from a lot of experience, because in some ways you can't consciously will that into being.
Yeah, and that's again a tricky thing where people say, well, I don't know exactly how I did it.
Right.
And it sounds like, this art is genius cliche, right? But of course it's...
Odd would say that sometimes when I...
Yeah, but it's a different thing, because it's, when you have so much experience, empirical study of nature, and he's been out there doing sketches,
right.
bringing paintings out and painting it on spot, but of course changing it even though it's in front of it. But when you have that much experience, things go so-called without thinking, because your hand and your eyes are thinking.
Yeah, yeah.
But you wouldn't be able to verbalize every step of the way afterwards, but it's still an empirical study and a rational approach to what you're doing.
I think the not sort of being able to relay the the thought process is a sign of what's called flow state, because
in the zone.
In the zone. And that's great. That is probably the thing about painting I'm like most addicted to is, it's just there's like a hope that maybe this session I will get into a state that is like flow state. Like that's one of the most wonderful experiences. Yeah.
Yeah. I think about something you mentioned that I hadn't heard about. You talked about the default mode network.
Yeah.
What the hell is that? And
Yeah.
how does it relate to what we're
I'm
talking
sorry
about?
it has such a horrible robotic name. Default mode network. Like,
No, I get very romantic when I hear that too. Default mode. Oh my god.
Yeah. Yeah. Well, that's this idea. I mean, it's an interesting idea, and it relates, in my mind, to how you see the world, for sure, because it's basically like an operating system concept that you try to relay everything back into, all of your experiences and all of your thoughts. It's this like constructed vision of like a story that you hold and constantly run in your mind. Even when you try not to think of anything, it's still going. And it relates all your experiences back to this larger concept of the story of you and your life in this world. And that has become of interest to me in terms of, because I've always wondered what is so interesting to me about, these experiences of awe in nature, or this feeling of being in the big nature, this concept, and what it does to me physically. So one of the things that happens, they've studied, is that your default mode network kind of gets sort of turned off momentarily. And the other way people access that is through psychedelics. And so they're using, for example, Johns Hopkins is using psychedelics to treat people with depression and anxiety, with the idea that if you kind of disrupt the default mode network momentarily, you can address aspects of this personal story that might have, maybe you had an experience that kind of came in as almost like a virus to the operating system, and then you have this concept of yourself in the big story that's a little bit damaged, and then you can address that part and clear it out, sometimes in one session. So the default mode network, it seems to be, if we can kind of manage that and address that, it seems like a way that a lot of people can heal themselves without having to become a lifetime subscriber of some pharmaceutical that doesn't solve any problems, but just makes you, a paying member of some system. Mm. Yeah.
But is there a relation between that and
painting?
Painting?
Yeah.
Because you did mention it, and I didn't get it fully, but I thought there was some connection here in terms of how the actual rough manner of painting relates to that. Yeah.
I'm still sorting that out, and actually I met another painter recently who was in her thesis at school was actually studying that to try to see if highly representational painting versus loose painting and how that affected the default mode network. Mm-hmm. So my idea is that when you the default mode network is a very rigid structure, and it's very, very strong. It's constantly running. There's no room for other things to come in. When it's running full power, you're not in the open manner. So if you, but when you allow a space for projection and contemplation, and you're able to, pay a little bit more attention to how your own mind works. Well, if you're looking at a painting that is charming and engaging, that you want to spend time with, and you can almost observe how the visual system works, and you can sort of get in touch with your own, thought processes.
So you can sort of free you from being in that constant running.
Yeah, well, it's not
So it's sort of like being on drugs.
Yeah.
Or like what the John Hopkins idea.
Yeah, Flaying Marsyas was completely hallucinatory to me. I wasn't on any drugs at all, or alcohol or anything. It just was, it was so vividly alive and moving. Like I couldn't.
So you
believe
experience a different reality, and because it's so much more living, the way it's painted, you actually can enter that world or can.
And it triggered a state of awe.
Right.
In its sort of magic, the magic transformation of paint. Like I'm looking at a two-dimensional object that appears to be moving in front of me, but I'm still aware that it's just paint. I'm like very aware of it on the surface. It's not something, I'm not delivered something that is fully described.
But it's like a safe place to go into a different world because you know at the same time it's not an actual living situation.
Right. Yeah. So like if you came around the corner in the woods and it was like, oh, it's just a bunch of people flaying a guy alive.
I'll join.
That's charming. I'll just sit here and watch.
Well, if you stand looking at that and you think it's a real situation, like literally, then that's a different case, I guess.
Right.
But okay. But hey, we haven't talked about Rembrandt here, and the Frick portrait here.
There he is.
But yeah. Whoa! Wow. There's one thing that fascinates me also, because there is a connection here. Was it the Marsyas that was shortly or maybe even a year in Amsterdam, so that Rembrandt saw it?
Yep. And yeah.
That must have been a major transformation.
Yeah. Legend has it that that was a big motivator to push him into his sort of late style of painting. He recognized something in that, and this painting of his is an example of late work, and I think is also very inspired by tales from antiquity, because the printing press was recently invented, and so now there was a lot of access to these great texts that were kind of rediscovered in the Renaissance, early Renaissance. And so I was looking, I always thought it was just, a regular old self-portrait that would just happen to be more clothes. And I kind of, looked at it and like, yeah, it kind of does look like he has breasts a little bit, but I didn't really think much of it. But I was looking at some Rembrandt book with Odd one evening, and he just kind of just made a side comment. Oh yeah, that's Rembrandt's painting of him as a blind hermaphrodite. I was like, what? He's like, yeah, look at the breasts. I'm like, huh. And he's like, and the shadow over the eye. Oh. So I just kind of like plugged that away in the back of my head, and he was in New York one time, and we were at the Frick, and we were sitting across from this painting, but we weren't looking at it. We kept like kind of side looking at it. We were both like, we knew it was there, and we were going to like visit it in a couple of minutes, but we were kind of just talking about other stuff for a moment. And he's like, okay, let's go see it. So we go up, and I don't know if this is inappropriate to say, but I mean, he pointed out an aspect of it that further supported the idea that maybe this is a painting of the hermaphrodite, but he kind of sort of loudly uttered, "Look at his pussy!"
There is an indication there. Yeah.
There is like a sense of a camel toe, but it's late Rembrandt, and I don't think they're just arbitrary details. It's not like he can't control his brush, and it's just
well, he was old. His eyes were failing him.
I was like, that's a self-portrait. Do I have breasts? I have breasts. I have a vagina? Yeah, sure. I don't remember. I'm old. No. So I started to, look into it a little bit, and then saw that in Ovid's Metamorphosis, there's a story about Tiresias, and I could tell that story. Yeah. So Zeus and Hera are having an argument about, who has more pleasure from sex, a man or a woman? And Zeus is like, well, women, clearly. And Hera's like, is that so? like, because he's always like running around having sex with everyone and transforming. So she's really pissed off. And they see this, this shepherd walking along, and he sees these two snakes intertwined and starts kind of poking them with a stick. But, you're not supposed to do anything that would draw the attention of the gods because, something could happen. So they're like, hey, look at that guy poking those snakes over there. And they zap him. Turn him into...
Okay.
Turn him into a woman, and apparently he lives, 7 years, 9 years. There's different stories. And, one story is that, like, he became a famous prostitute, and, like
totally into a woman, or
man
and woman?
Turned into a woman.
Yeah.
And
so not a hermaphrodite.
Not a hermaphrodite.
Okay.
And experiences sex as a woman. And so after a period of time, because, time is relative, and for the gods, probably, 9 years is like a half a second or something. So they're like, so what's the deal? Who has more pleasure? And so Tiresias says, well, for every pleasure a man feels, a woman feels 9. And Hera was pissed and blinds him. And Zeus is like, oh, dude, I'm so sorry for my wife. Here, have a gift of prophecy on me. Here you go. So he's like sent back into the world, kind of this like, man, woman, knows both and is blind, but has prophecy, and then shows up in all of these stories from ancient Greece. So he's
King Oedipus, for example.
Yeah, he's the one who reluctantly tells Oedipus what he sees.
Oh my God.
Yeah.
Speaking of the essence of it, I never forget, I just have to say it. I read that, and there's one point where Oedipus is threatening to beat him up if it doesn't say who killed his father.
Right.
And Tiresias says, because he knows that he killed his father, Tiresias says, you will have a father today. You will lose everything today. And then the whole thing just crashes. It's... Sorry.
Yeah. And then, so that's one of his cameos. He, she, it's cameos. They.
Yeah. Z. Yeah.
I don't know what pronoun.
We try to cover everything.
I don't know what pronoun Tiresias would use.
This is a complicated matter.
It is.
Okay.
It is. And then again, of course, in the Odyssey. And I think
when the Odysseus goes to the underworld.
Yeah.
To get advice.
Yeah. To find his way home. Circe says, the sorceress says, well, if you want to find your way home, you need to go to Hades, and you need to visit Tiresias and make him an offering. I'll just use him for simplicity, and talk to him. So he goes into Hades, and I think like sacrifices an ox or something. And one of the things, because he has the gift of prophecy in the afterworld, he has all of his wits about him. Unlike the other shades, which are just, like crawling and like they don't have their mind, they're just sort of wandering around. But he's fully cognizant and is sort of like this like medium to access other shades. So he, offers the ox, but then, tries to get the advice on the way home, but also asks to see his mother. So I think that is the story that probably may have contributed to this image, because one of the sort of acknowledgments of sort of the symbols is that it's a little cut off here by the frame, but at the end of this sash going over his stomach, which is like the two snakes intertwined, and he has this stick that he hit the snakes with.
Oh, right.
At the bottom of the sash is a pomegranate. And a pomegranate is a symbol of Hades.
Yes.
Yeah. So this, I think, is, and one of the ideas I had is, so Rembrandt painted the laughing Zeuxis and, some other Greek-inspired, maybe the circle in the background of the one portrait is also inspired by some of the tales from Pliny. And so my thought is that Rembrandt sat down with the idea like, okay, I'm going to paint myself as Apelles. And then he was like, oh, that's so like literal and boring. Like I can do better than that. So he thought, well, who would Apelles paint himself as the greatest painter? He's not going to paint himself as another painter. And he is the only one who was permitted to paint Alexander the Great. So he's appreciated for his ability to, depict personality and character. So naturally he'd want to depict himself as like the greatest seer of human beings, who is Tiresias. Because he is, he's not judging someone for being a man or a woman, and he is also a prophet. He can see their future. So, and that was one of the things, to go back to Apelles, a story that I noticed was that it was said that in his portraits that people who were able to look at faces and tell their future, they were able to do that from his portraits.
That's badass.
Yeah, so that's another like tie-in to Tiresias, Apelles.
Right, and another fascinating thing is that Rembrandt was highly aware of this. I think what you're saying there about why he painted that portrait is very likely to be true. That at least that the whole conception, and I think it is. I think it's in Rembrandt's eyes. That's Simon Schama.
Oh yeah,
where he talks about sort of the same thing, but with Aristotle with the bust of Homer, and that Rembrandt. That's fascinating. They were generally aware of this, but then there was this other painter, Govert Flinck, and he was called Apelles Flinck. And I don't know if that pun works in Dutch, but Flinck in Norwegian means skilled or good. But anyways, but he was very fine and clear and a sort of pearl-like in way of painting. And I guess this Schama's point is that Rembrandt painting, apparently Aristotle with the bust of Homer, is actually Apelles with that chain, where you have Alexander, and then he has Homer there.
Yeah.
He was saying that I am the one who is continuing the spirit or the cause of Apelles, or of the rough manner of painting. Yeah.
And I think Odd said that the presence of the medallions in Rembrandt's early paintings was him reflecting on being like the court painter of Alexander. So I think it's very possible, also because it was very popular in Rembrandt's day. There was even like a guild, or like some kind of like a club of painters that was called like the Guild of Apelles. It was very widespread. The interest in that text at that time.
And I'm thinking about in Titian's case. Obviously, I presume reading Pliny, but also Aristotle, the Poetics. But there's something that we saw when we did that hunt of Odd Nerdrum, that he stopped by Florence and most probably saw Masaccio's murals there.
Right.
And that is also a type of technique, a type of rough technique, because if you compare it to Mussolini, it's much more not so naturalistic as Mussolini is. So there might have been some influence from there, and maybe even Masaccio read Pliny. I don't know.
Yeah, perhaps. Yeah.
But it's fascinating that they were so clear and aware of what they were doing.
Yeah.
Because the cliche is that Titian got bad eyesight in his old days, right? That's why he started painting like that.
I know. I mean, I guess everyone gets bad eyesight.
Yeah, so there should be more Titians then.
Right. There should be more clear examples of that, but it seems like the real lineage and real connection between these painters that shifted their technique, like Rembrandt and, I mean, Odd has shifted his technique from earlier days.
Turner, Constable.
Yeah. That, you know, there was a clear like awareness of this, and I, you know, even Michelangelo apparently, and you know, he I think he said something about like, you know, if it's a good sculpture, it doesn't need to be overly polished.
Exactly.
And then he started signing his works with this, I think it's a word in an imperfect tense, saying I don't know how it's pronounced, but it's like phonetically it's spelled Facebot, and that means like when he would sign his name, it would mean like not that Michelangelo made this. He said Michelangelo was making this. So that, you know, this idea that the artwork is in a continuous state of being, that, you know, it's alive. It's captured in its process. It's not closed off and shut down and not living anymore. You're witnessing it in a state of becoming, and it's engaging you as a viewer to be part of that process. And I think that's the real idea of like the charming and open manner type painting.
Punchline. That was nice. Okay, David Molesky, thank you for coming to the Cave of Apelles.
Thank you for having me. It was really fun. Yeah.
I'd also like to thank our other top sponsors, Dean Anthony, Anders Berger Christensen, Eric Lasky, Herman Borge, Fernando Ramirez, Iver Ukkestad, Jon Harald Aspheim, Jack Ens Warner, Jared Fountain, Marion Bu Pedersen, Maurice Robbins, Misty Delane, Michael Irish, Richard Barrett, Stacey Evangelista, Trim Jordal, and Yngve Helland. And don't forget to head over to caveofapelles.com/subscribe and become a member today so you can access all of our videos. I'll see you next month.